Hello everyone, good to see a few familiar faces in the room today, mainly because I made sure you came along by giving you some tickets. Hi, I'm Adam. I'm the lead agile coach across the corporate bank in Deutsche Bank. To say that it's a large organisation is a mild understatement, and to say that we've got some legacy is clear by the fact that we spent 150 years in America as Deutsche Bank. This is talking very much to a practical example of a complex organisation. I'm really glad, actually, I'm quite late on in the day because you've heard some really good speakers today. The bit I'm going to talk to today is actually quite agnostic to what change you want to make. This is much more about you having an idea of what you want to do and a kind of approach and some kind of realistic example of how you actually get that done. And it could be based on all the wonderful stuff you've heard before. And I'm basically going to be referring to things like quarterly planning that we just heard about from the previous speakers. So let's get into it. So how can small teams make an impact in a big organisation? It's really easy to say, oh, if I had more people, I could do stuff. But companies face a huge amount of complexity. There's always going to be a shortage of resource. You know, as an agile coach, clearly you need to go and hire 20 more agile coaches. As a DevOps lead, clearly you need 20 more DevOps people. You know, we want to do something about the environment. We need a load of environmental specialists in there. It's just not practical for companies to endlessly hire people for the next initiative that's coming along. You have to manage within constraints. Now, I may think that the constraints I'm placed under are unfair given the task I've been given, but so will everyone else that has their things to do. So now you have to take a practical step back and go, the organisation still needs this change. I have a fixed amount of resource to make a change. How am I going to have an impact? And when you're faced off against a company the size of Deutsche Bank or News International or these other kinds of big organisations we've had people talking to in the room, you have to be realistic about what you can get done in what time frame, but still make sure that you can have an impact. So, you're faced with a big organisation, and it can really, really make your head hurt sometimes. You can start going down rabbit holes very quickly and get yourself all confused. And you go and speak to different people about the organisation, about the same problem, and they start coming up with completely different viewpoints about what's going on. And so before you know what you're doing, you're running around and around in circles, and eventually you just start going, okay, now my head's exploding. So, the way I solve this kind of a problem is to use systems thinking. So, who in this room has heard of systems thinking? And now be honest, who in this room has actually used systems thinking in their day-to-day work? It's a bit of a smaller subsection there. So for the people who can't see on the live stream, about 10%, I think, of the hands went up that put it up for the first time round. I'm going to show a practical implementation of systems thinking, which is something I've not just used in my current role, but I've used in some other companies, semiconductor company, there'll be an example right at the end on that one. And you may have heard of a company that makes exceedingly good cakes. I don't need to know the name, but I've worked there as well. Same kind of approach. So, first things first, you need to have some understanding of what your problem's going to be and to make sure everyone else does as well. So, you have to get transparency around whatever the problem is that you're deciding to fix. So, real-world example where I'm working at the moment, the first thing we needed to understand was the book of work. Huge organisation, local optimisation around how teams organise themselves. So, doesn't sound very agile as an agile coach to come in and say, we're going to standardise the way we represent the book of work in Jira, which is easily the easiest way to annoy lots of engineers, is to tell them to use Jira in a different way. And you get lots of things being thrown back at you again and again and again saying, well, that's not very agile, we're supposed to have autonomy in what we're supposed to be doing. Agile is not about complete autonomy. It's around alignment, tight alignment on purpose, autonomy and how you deliver the solution. I'm sure we can go into that in a bit more detail, but I've only got 20 minutes. So we have to have transparency around what the problem is that we're facing. You can't do that if you relentlessly locally optimize across a massive system. So there are certain things you have to make a choice on. If you're doing it around environmental impact, then you'll be doing transparency around the environmental impact in a way that everyone understands it. The one advantage this brings you, though, is that with transparency, you can finally prioritize, which we've heard about again in the previous example, but also in some of the other talks we've been talking around as well. You can't prioritize if you don't have transparency. You will have local prioritization that will then be conflicting, and then you wonder why teams aren't talking to each other. So this again starts coming back to this tight coupling around purpose. The advantage around this joint prioritization, even if people don't like what you prioritize, which is the clear problem that comes from this, is you do at least get alignment. So this is where the previous talk was talking about there was overcommitment in a book of work, and you could see how they did some work to try to slim that down. That requires alignment between the teams. It's around getting people to work together about we actually have to solve a particular problem. This is really, really key, because once you get beyond that step, you are going into the true agile piece where you're letting the teams go and build their solutions. But the other thing about this is this also talks to engineering. The root of engineering is ingenuity. You do not have limitless resources. You do not have an endless sandpit to play in. Engineering is about delivering a solution within constraints. And that goes back to the dawn of time. You've only got so much resource. You've only got so much time. You have to build within some form of architecture or some kind of regulatory demand or some kind of regional regulatory demand. These are all constraints. But as long as you have these first three, you stand a chance of at least building a solution that's going to work. Now, that's all well and good in terms of the what is it we're going to do. The how we do it requires a bit that people don't like hearing about Agile, which is discipline. In fact, you probably have to be more disciplined to make either Scrum or Kanban systems work than you would do with a waterfall system where someone's actually just telling you do this, do that, do the other. Because with great power comes great responsibility, or even with minor power comes minor responsibility, but you've still got to be disciplined about it. So this is a very easy kind of step to go through, but it's a huge amount of work to get there, and especially maintaining the discipline. But you can't keep the discipline without the other bits beforehand, because otherwise it's unfair on the teams. They don't know what it is they're actually aiming for. So, make it as simple as possible. So simple even a baby can say it. Got the Dada loop. Now, you've probably heard of OOLA loops, or you've heard of all these other kind of feedback, plan, do, check, act, all that kind of stuff. This is an incredibly fundamental and simple thing. It's so simple that people often forget about actually thinking about this. It's this, if you think about taking a step, your eyes are recording data, your brain does analysis about your body position, you make a decision to put your step forward, you take the action, and then your brain's recording the next set of data and off you go. Or you're doing an annual budgeting process over a massive multinational company, and you go through the same thing again. Where do we want to invest resources? Let's make some decision about funding and see what actions we can take in order to meet the market requirements. It's a really simple concept, but you have to actively think about this if you want to make a change. Because if you do not have this loop built and robust, the change will not go in. Fundamentally, it will not go in. The reason we decided on the standardization of our book of work was to get the data in the first place. What is the actual book of work? What's really happening on the ground? That allows the analysis to happen in terms of the quarterly planning processes, the way teams are working day to day, that allows the decisions to be made about what work has to be prioritized and acted on, and then the action comes through. This data has to be timely. It has to be of a good enough quality you can actually make a decision off the back of this stuff. It's all well and good having data you think is all right, but if it doesn't get to the decision makers on time, it's no good. They can't make a decision off the back of it. But it could be you don't even have the data in the first place at all. And this is the really key point. You need to think about the system within which you are operating, the problem which you are trying to solve, and then actually ask yourself, do we actually have the right data at the right time for people to even start this loop? Not let's make do, or let's just throw lots of data at the team. I think one of the earlier speakers was talking about just throwing metrics at people and just hope they find their way through it all. Boil it back. What's the key thing you want to measure? So the previous team was talking about overcommitment. That might just be your view on this book of work. We don't want to overcommit. That's all we want to have a look at in the first place. But the key thing is the quicker you can get around this loop, the faster your organisation as a whole will be acting. And it means that people like me don't need to handhold you around the process anymore. So the role of myself and my team, some of which are in this room, is to consciously build these loops, to actively look at the organisation and see where are these loops failing. Because if we can fix the loop, we don't have to fix the problem, because we've got thousands of people who are really smart in their area that can fix the problem. They're just not getting the information they need to make those right decisions. So you may be asked, how long will it take to make a change? The previous speakers were talking about the fact they had something like 3 weeks to set up a quarterly planning cycle. For me, it might be, I can set that up in a couple. We had to do something similar in a couple of weeks with one of my colleagues in the room here. I'm sure he'll smile at the memory of that. But that's not really the question that I need to be able to answer. I need to answer, how long can I make a change that lasts? Because if this change isn't lasting, every time we want to do that process, it's going to come back to me. And I've got a small team. And I'm then going to be encapsulated in this endless support of this business function, and I'm never going to make a big change on the organisation. So again, it's about how long is it going to take for the organisation to become stable in this process so that I can step away with my team and go on to something else. Again, it doesn't matter if it's Agile or whether it's DevOps or whatever else it wants you to do. You have to hand this stuff off and get away from it so you can move on to the next thing. Otherwise, your capacity will be completely used up and then you're static again. So, if I wanted to implement a quarterly planning cycle, like we mentioned earlier on, but I wanted it to be stable enough for me to walk away, how long will that take? Now I'm going to energize you all by asking you to stand up, because you've all had a nice lunch and you've been sat down in front of people for a while. So get everybody on their feet. And I'm going to start reading out some time periods, okay? So your challenge is your me, and you want to have an idea of how long it's going to take for the quarterly planning cycle to be so stable you don't need to support it actively anymore with your team. So would it be after 1 quarter? If it is, feel free to sit down. Would it be after 2 quarters? 3 quarters? 4 quarters? 5 quarters? We're getting some really pessimistic people here. 2 years. Okay, so we've got a rough feel here of between about 3 quarters and infinity, but we're saying it's about, but most of the people sat down between about 3 quarters and 4 quarters. So, why? Why do people instinctively come to that kind of conclusion? There is a bit of a way of thinking about this. There's no law around it, and I don't think the Lenander law is going to stick. So I'm just going to stick some silly pictures up just to talk through it all. But you can't get a trend line out of any single data point. Well, you'd be very brave to draw a trend line from this anyway, going back to sort of basic maths. Now, as we start adding in data points, our cone of uncertainty about whether something's going in starts to shrink, because we can start to trust the data. Now, this could be, how well are you measuring your agile adoption of quarterly planning, or what is my mean time to recover on something is a sustained period of time. You need to keep recording your data points over a particular period, till eventually you end up with something where you're thinking, well, do you know what? And I'm sure statistics here could come in and say, oh, it could still lie outside that line. But in terms of a practical example on how you can actually go around and do stuff, once you've got through 3 or 4 cycles or something, you're getting to a point whereby you can start to see a trend line. Quarterly planning, most of you sat down instinctively after about 4 data points. Some of you after 3. And it might be that's good enough for you to go. But the key thing is going back to that Dada loop, you have to get round that loop and actually go through the process at the pace of the process a certain number of times before you can feel like you actually understand what's going on. And so for the team that was on beforehand, they will probably see a point whereby it starts to get to a level of embeddedness where people just see this as the default way of doing things. After about 3-4 cycles, the amount of hand-holding will really, really come away. Now, this is a really interesting insight, because if you're doing something different, if you're working as a Scrum Master on a team and you want to make a change to a daily stand-up routine, you can get through that in a week because you're just running this so quickly. If I want to change the annual budgeting process for the government, it's going to take us a while, folks. You know, we've got a bit of a feedback loop to get through here. So this is the thing. This is systems thinking. This is thinking about how the system responds to change. But it's coming back to a practical example of, if I want to change this thing, how often is this thing happening? How often is my sprint planning taking place? It might take me a couple of months to make a significant change to the way that we operate for that to come in. And once you understand that feedback loop, you can start going back with answers that 9 times out of 10 will land. And there's always the edge case, you know, this kind of thing. This is the joy of living in an ambiguous world. But it gives you some kind of hook. So then when you do stand in front of the CEO, like I've had the pleasure of doing, and say, how long is this thing going to take? It says, well, we can get a planning system in place in the next year. Then we can be starting to work on the next thing, and you just see the colour drain from their face, you know. So, but in the nicest possible way, we can probably start kicking off something after 2 or 3 cycles, but that's going to start going through its own change curve. It gives you a chance to try to do some kind of basic modelling of how busy your team is going to be, going out into a reasonable time frame, but there's no milestones involved, there's nothing specific to it. It's just a behavioural thing for the organisations itself. The other advantage is, though, is if you do put the measures in place, you can see whether or not you are actually tightening this cone. Because if these crosses start going all over the place, your feedback is wild and crazy, then you actually haven't got onto this cycle. So that's a warning sign to say, we know we're going to miss this. There's something we've missed in the system. We need to go and dig into it again. So then it comes to the point of small teams, big impact again. What are the things that you actually need to focus on? And be very, very, very conscious of the fact that you can't fix all of this in one go, okay? Not if you've got a small team. You have to choose your most important area for your context, for your question. This is where the think bit comes in. Target the weakest link in this. If this bit is missing, then that's where you put your focus in. And if it happens to be that it's actually on the team planning side of things, then you're lucky, you're going to get through that cycle quickly. But if it's tied to the QBR, then it's going to take you a year to really get that embedded in. But also think of the feedback loop. It's very easy to think of the top-down stuff. That's the stuff that's nice and easy to publish. You send an email from the CEO and everyone looks at it and just checks what's going on. Trying to get this purple line in place can be far more tricky, and it will take you a lot of time for people to have a look at. So I'm going to give you an example, real-world example. This is something I did in a semiconductor plant. This is actually vastly simplified. And what we were then doing, as a team of 2, was looking for which of these arrows was the weakest one in the link, and then we just focused in on that one, but applied the cycle time on all this kind of thing. And I've drawn similar maps in my current role and in that exceedingly good cake company, you know, and this kind of thing. It really works. It really does work, because what it forces you to do is to exclude the noise, okay? Look at the bit of the system you actually want to change and make sure it's in place. But because this is a data feedback loop, you will be getting hard data to tell you whether or not you've made a difference, which when you're doing things like agile transformation can be really tough. You know, the most common question I get is, what's the value of an agile coach? If I say to people at the beginning, it's building a feedback loop, they just look at me and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. But when you've actually got this stuff starting to happen, it becomes a bit more resonant with the organisation. Got 1 minute 49 left. So here we go. Systems thinking applies across all levels, but you really need to be careful about your implementation times on this, okay? You can try to speed things up slightly by intensive training, but like riding a bicycle, the easiest way to learn how to do something is to actually do it yourself, not to have someone like me tell you how good this thing is. And so if you've got someone who's really receptive and really wants to take things on board, it might speed it up a little bit, but I'll be very cautious about making any brash predictions off the back of that. You know, you've just got to let the system adapt sometimes. So that's it from myself. Hopefully you enjoyed that talk, and I shall hand you over to the wonderful Owen.